The autumn wind whipped Jane Owens' hair as she stood at the edge of Willow Creek, watching her reflection ripple and distort in the water below, wondering if any man would ever see past the scar that sliced down her left cheek, a permanent reminder of the fire that had claimed her parents' lives 10 years ago. Silver Springs, Colorado, 1878, a town where gossip traveled faster than the weekly stagecoach and reputations were as fragile as the wildflowers that dotted the prairie. Jane had lived there all her 22 years, working as the town's schoolteacher since she was 18, respected for her mind but pitted for her appearance. "Miss Owens," a small voice called out, drawing Jane from her thoughts. Little Emma Prescott came running toward her, blonde braids bouncing with each step. "Are you coming to the harvest dance tomorrow night? Ma says everyone's talking about it." Jane smiled gently. "I'm not sure, Emma. I have lessons to prepare. But you have to come. It's going to be the most wonderful night of the year." The child's enthusiasm was infectious, but Jane felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. The harvest dance was the social event of the year in Silver Springs, where matches were made and courtships began. For Jane, it had always been an evening of sidelong glances and whispered comments. Yet every year, something pulled her there, perhaps the stubborn hope that this time might be different. "We'll see," Jane replied, patting the girl's shoulder. "Now run along home before your mother worries." As Emma scampered away, Jane caught sight of a rider on the hill overlooking the creek. Even from a distance, she recognized Grant Callahan by his distinctive silhouette, broad-shouldered and straight-backed in the saddle. The newest rancher in the area had arrived 6 months ago, purchasing the old Davidson property and transforming it with quiet efficiency. Their paths had crossed occasionally in town, each encounter brief, but leaving Jane with a curious warmth she didn't quite understand. He was polite but reserved, offering little about his past beyond that he'd come from Texas seeking a fresh start. Rumors suggested he'd been a Texas Ranger, or perhaps something less savory, but Grant never confirmed nor denied the whispers. Jane turned away from the creek, heading back toward her small cabin at the edge of town. Tomorrow would bring what it would, whether she attended the dance or not. The schoolhouse had been transformed for the harvest dance. Bundles of dried corn husks decorated the walls, and paper lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the worn wooden floor. A makeshift band played in the corner, fiddle, banjo, and harmonica, creating a lively backdrop for the evening's festivities. Jane stood in the doorway, her palms damp against the fabric of her best dress, a deep blue calico that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her slighter frame. She'd spent hours preparing, arranging her chestnut hair in a style that partially concealed her scar, though nothing could hide it completely. "Jane, you came after all." Martha Wilson, the blacksmith's wife, approached with genuine warmth. "I'm so glad. We need more women to balance out all these rowdy men." Indeed, the room seemed to overflow with cowhands from the surrounding ranches, their Sunday best unable to completely disguise the rough edges of men who spent their days on horseback. Several nodded respectfully in Jane's direction, former students who had traded schoolbooks for saddles years ago. As Martha was pulled away by her husband for a dance, Jane made her way to the refreshment table, accepting a cup of cider from Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife. "Mighty fine turnout this year," Mrs. Peterson commented, surveying the room. Even that mysterious Mr. Callahan showed up. "Been here nearly half a year and hardly speaks more than necessary to anyone." Jane followed Mrs. Peterson's gaze to where Grant Callahan stood against the far wall, looking distinctly uncomfortable in his clean black shirt and vest. Their eyes met briefly across the room before Jane quickly looked away, her cheeks warming. "Miss Owens, would you care to dance?" Jane turned to find Sheriff Wallace extending his hand. In his 50s, with silver streaking his temples, the sheriff had always been kind to Jane, treating her with a fatherly affection since her parents' passing. "I'd be honored, Sheriff," she replied, setting down her cider. As they joined the other couples on the floor, Jane was acutely aware of the glances cast her way. The music swelled, and she concentrated on following the sheriff's lead, counting steps in her mind to distract from her self-consciousness. When the dance ended, Jane thanked the sheriff and made to step away, but another hand reached for hers. Thomas Henley, son of the wealthiest merchant in town, stood before her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Owens, surely you'll favor me with the next dance." His voice carried just enough for those nearby to hear. Jane hesitated. Thomas had been cruel to her in their school days, leading the taunts about her scar. Though they'd both grown to adulthood, his smile still held that hint of meanness she remembered all too well. I was just going to rest a moment," she stammered. "Nonsense," Thomas insisted, his grip tightening slightly on her hand. "Everyone's watching. You wouldn't want to seem unfriendly, would you?" Reluctantly, Jane allowed him to lead her back onto the floor as the music began again. Thomas danced well, but kept her uncomfortably close, his breath hot against her ear. "You know, Jane, you might not be the prettiest filly in the corral, but a man could do worse," he murmured. "Father says a schoolteacher would make a sensible wife." Jane stiffened. "I'm not looking for a husband, Mr. Henley." Thomas laughed, the sound cutting. "With that face? You should take what offers come your way." He spun her roughly, causing her to stumble. "Though I suppose even damaged goods have their uses." Jane's eyes burned with unshed tears as she tried to pull away, but Thomas held firm, his smile now openly mocking. Around them, she noticed several of his friends watching and snickering. "Let me go," she whispered fiercely. "Why?" "Embarrassed to be seen with the most eligible bachelor in town." Thomas turned her again. This time, so her scarred cheek was prominently displayed to onlookers. "Hey, everyone, look who's finally found herself a dance partner." Laughter rippled through a section of the crowd. Thomas's friends and their partners, people who had always found Jane an easy target. The music continued, but seemed to fade as blood rushed to Jane's ears. "That's enough." The deep voice cut through the noise like a knife. Grant Callahan stood beside them, his expression unreadable, but his eyes hard as flint as they fixed on Thomas. "This isn't your concern, Callahan," Thomas sneered, though his grip on Jane loosened slightly. "The lady wants to be released. That makes it my concern." Grant's voice remained level, but something in his stance suggested he was prepared for whatever might come next. Thomas hesitated, looking from Grant to the growing circle of onlookers. With a dismissive laugh, he dropped Jane's hand. "She's all yours. Damaged goods, anyway." For a moment, Jane thought Grant might hit Thomas. Instead, he turned to her and with surprising gentleness, offered his hand. "Miss Owens, would you do me the honor of this dance?" Jane's heart hammered in her chest. The entire room seemed to be watching, waiting for her response. She should leave, retreat to the safety of her cabin and the books that never judged her. Yet something in Grant's steady gaze gave her courage. "Yes, Mr. Callahan, I would." As she placed her hand in his, Grant leaned close to speak only for her ears. "Dance only with me for the rest of the night. I promise no one will mock you again." The music swelled once more as Grant led her smoothly across the floor, his hand respectfully at her waist, maintaining a proper distance unlike Thomas had done. Jane gradually relaxed under his sure guidance, finding herself able to enjoy the movement and music for perhaps the first time in her life. "I apologize for interfering," Grant said quietly, "but I couldn't stand by watching that." "Thank you," Jane replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Though you've probably ruined your reputation by associating with the town scarecrow." Grant's expression darkened. "Anyone who judges you by a scar rather than your character isn't worth considering." His eyes met hers directly. "And from what I've observed these past months, Miss Owens, your character is beyond reproach." Jane felt a blush creep up her neck. "You've been observing me, Mr. Callahan?" A hint of a smile touched his lips. "It's a small town, and you're its most dedicated teacher. I've seen how you stay late helping children who struggle, and how you gave your lunch to the Wilson boy last week when he had none." Jane was startled he had noticed such things. "You're quite observant." "I was trained to be." Something fleeting crossed his features before he masked it again. "May I escort you home when the dancing is done?" "I'd consider it an honor." As they continued to dance, Jane became aware that the mockery had ceased. Instead, curious glances followed them around the floor. Grant Callahan, the mysterious rancher who rarely socialized, was dancing exclusively with the scarred schoolteacher. It was gossip in the making. "People will talk," she warned him. "Let them," he replied simply. By the third dance together, Jane had forgotten to be self-conscious. Grant was an excellent dancer, and his calm presence beside her acted as a shield against the curious stares. When they finally stepped outside into the cool autumn night, Jane felt lighter than she had in years. The walk to her cabin was short, but Grant insisted on accompanying her, his stride measured to match her smaller steps. The moon cast silver light across the landscape, illuminating the path ahead. "May I ask about the scar?" Grant's question came quietly as they approached her porch. "Not because it matters to me, but because I sense it matters greatly to you." Jane's hand instinctively rose to her cheek. No one had ever asked so directly before. "There was a fire when I was 12, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "My parents didn't survive. I was pulled out, but not before." Her fingers traced the jagged line that ran from her temple to her jaw. Grant nodded, his expression solemn. "I'm sorry for your loss, and sorrier still that others have made you feel less because of a mark of survival." When they reached her door, Jane turned to face him, gathering her courage. "Why did you ask me to dance, Mr. Callahan? Truly." In the moonlight, Grant's face seemed younger, the hard lines softened. "Because I've wanted to since the first time I saw you reading to children under that big oak by the schoolhouse. Your face was so alive with the story you were telling." He paused. "The scar is part of you, Miss Owens, but it's not who you are." Jane felt something shift inside her, like ice breaking on a frozen river. Would you like to call on me properly sometime, Mr. Callahan?" His smile then was genuine, transforming his usually stern features. "I'd like nothing better. Sunday after church." She nodded, her own smile feeling strange and wonderful on her lips. "Sunday it is." As Jane watched Grant walk back toward town, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness, she wondered if perhaps the harvest dance had changed her life after all. Sunday arrived bright and clear. Jane sat in her usual pew at church, trying to focus on Reverend Miller's sermon rather than the tall figure seated several rows behind her. When the service ended, she found herself lingering on the church steps, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors while her heart pounded in anticipation. "Miss Owens." Grant's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him holding his hat in his hands, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I thought perhaps we might walk to the lake, if that would be agreeable to you." Jane nodded, acutely aware of the curious gazes following them as they set off toward the small lake that bordered the eastern edge of town. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes before Grant spoke again. "I should tell you about myself," he began, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "I came here from Texas, as you know, but there's more to it than seeking new opportunities." Jane listened as Grant revealed his past, how he'd indeed been a Texas Ranger, dedicated to upholding the law until a confrontation with a notorious outlaw gang had left him the sole survivor of his patrol. Disillusioned and haunted by the loss of his comrades, he'd headed north seeking peace and anonymity. "The nightmares still come," he admitted quietly. "Less frequently now, but they're part of me, just as your scar is part of you." Jane understood then that they were both marked by their pasts, though his scars lay hidden beneath the surface. "We all carry something, don't we?" she said gently. Their Sunday walk became a weekly tradition. Throughout the autumn weeks that followed, Jane discovered a Grant Callahan few in town ever saw a man who could name every wildflower they passed, who carried a volume of poetry in his saddlebag, and whose laugh, rare as it was, transformed his entire being. In turn, Grant learned of Jane's dreams to expand the school, to perhaps one day build a proper library for Silver Springs where children and adults alike could discover worlds beyond their small town. He listened with genuine interest to her ideas about education and the future she envisioned. As October gave way to November, their walks extended to shared meals and evenings on Jane's porch, talking until the stars emerged overhead. The town buzzed with gossip about the unlikely pair, but for once, Jane found herself unbothered by the whispers. On the first snowfall of the season, Grant arrived at her cabin with a gift, a leather-bound journal with creamy blank pages waiting to be filled. "For your thoughts and dreams," he explained, uncharacteristically shy as he handed it to her. "Or perhaps for stories of your own. You tell the children's tales so beautifully. I thought perhaps you might want to write some down." Jane traced the soft leather with her fingertips, deeply touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. It's perfect." As they sat by her fire that evening, sharing a pot of tea and comfortable silence, Grant suddenly spoke. I've never told anyone this, but I came to Silver Springs because my grandmother once described it as the most beautiful place she'd ever seen. She grew up here before moving to Texas as a young bride. What was her name? Perhaps the older residents might remember her family. Sarah Jenkins, before she married my grandfather, Grant replied. She spoke of a creek with willows that turned golden in autumn. Jane's eyes widened. Willow Creek. It runs right through town. A smile touched Grant's lips. I found it my first week here. Sitting by those willows, I felt her presence somehow. His eyes met Jane's, a vulnerability in them she'd never seen before. And then a few months later, I saw you there, standing with your reflection rippling in the water, and something just fit. Jane felt her heart quicken. Is that why you started watching me? I wasn't watching, Grant protested, though a blush crept up his neck. Just noticing. There's a difference. Jane laughed, the sound bubbling up naturally. Is there now, Mr. Ranger? His expression grew serious, though warmth remained in his eyes. Jane, I don't have much to offer. My ranch is modest, and I'm still learning this land. But I do know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. The air between them seemed to still, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Jane set down her teacup with trembling hands. They've been mine as well. Grant reached across the small space between them, his calloused fingers gently brushing against her scarred cheek. May I kiss you, Jane? Rather than answer, Jane leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers with gentle reverence that quickly deepened into something more, a promise, a beginning. When they finally pulled apart, Grant rested his forehead against hers. I'm falling in love with you, Jane Owens. I think I started falling that day by the creek, and I haven't stopped since. Tears pricked Jane's eyes as she whispered back, I'm falling too. And it terrifies me. Why? Because I never thought anyone could look at me and see past this. Her fingers traced her scar. Grant took her hand, bringing her fingertips to his lips. I see you, Jane. All of you. And everything I see, I adore. Winter deepened its hold on Silver Springs, transforming the landscape into a world of white. Grant's visits continued despite the snow, his horse leaving trails of hoofprints that connected his ranch to Jane's cabin. The town's initial shock at their courtship had mellowed to acceptance, though Thomas Henley and his friends still cast dark looks whenever they crossed paths. On Christmas Eve, the entire town gathered at the church for carols and celebration. Jane stood beside Grant, their voices joining with the others in silent night, their breath visible in the cold air. After the singing concluded, they lingered outside as others dispersed to their homes. Would you walk with me a moment? Grant asked, offering her his arm. They strolled through the quiet town, the buildings outlined in moonlight and fresh snow. Grant led her toward Willow Creek, now frozen over and bordered by bare branches hung with icicles that glittered like diamonds. It's beautiful, Jane breathed, taking in the transformed landscape. Not as beautiful as you, Grant replied, turning to face her. His expression was serious, almost solemn, as he took her gloved hands in his. Jane, these past months have shown me what I want for the rest of my life. Jane's heart hammered against her ribs as Grant reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. Kneeling in the snow before her, he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. Jane Owens, you've brought light back into my life when I thought it was lost forever. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Tears spilled down Jane's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. When she finally found her voice, it emerged as a joyful whisper. Yes, Grant. Yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger over her glove, promising it would be properly sized later, then rose to his feet and pulled her into an embrace that lifted her off the ground, spinning her once before setting her gently down again. It was my grandmother's, he explained, nodding toward the ring. My mother gave it to me before she passed, said to save it for when I found a love worthy of it. Jane looked down at the ring, then back to Grant's face, illuminated by moonlight. I'll cherish it always. They were married in the church on the first day of spring, when wildflowers had just begun to dot the hills around Silver Springs. Jane wore a cream-colored dress with lace at the collar and cuffs, her hair arranged with sprigs of lavender. Grant waited at the altar in a new black suit, his expression transforming from nervousness to wonder as she walked toward him on Sheriff Wallace's arm. The entire town turned out for the celebration that followed. Even those who had once mocked Jane now offering congratulations with seeming sincerity. As the sun began to set, Grant led his bride toward the wagon that would take them to their home, his ranch. Now theirs together. "Are you ready, Mrs. Callahan?" he asked, helping her up onto the seat. Jane savored the sound of her new name. "More than ready, Mr. Callahan." Their ranch flourished under their combined care. Jane continued teaching until the following year when their first child, a daughter, they named Sarah after Grant's grandmother, arrived with the spring thaw. 2 years later, a son joined their family, strong-lunged and curious from his first breath. Grant expanded their holdings, breeding horses that became known throughout Colorado for their quality and temperament. Jane's dream of a library for Silver Springs came true on her 28th birthday, when Grant surprised her with a newly constructed building in town, stocked with books he'd been secretly collecting from Denver and beyond. On autumn evenings, they often walked to Willow Creek, sometimes with their children running ahead, sometimes alone with fingers intertwined and heads bent close in conversation. It was on one such evening, 10 years after they'd married, that they encountered Thomas Henley again. He'd left Silver Springs years earlier after his father's business failed, heading to Denver to rebuild his fortune. Now he stood before them on the creek's bank, his clothes fine but his face showing the hard lines of a difficult decade. "Miss Owens, Mrs. Callahan, I should say," he acknowledged with a nod that held none of his former arrogance. "Mr. Callahan." Grant's arm tightened protectively around Jane's waist, but his voice remained neutral. "Henley, heard you were back in town." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the ground before rising again to meet Jane's eyes. "I came to make amends, actually, for how I behaved years ago, at the harvest dance and before that too." He swallowed hard. "I was cruel without cause, and I've regretted it for years." Jane studied the man before her, seeing not the tormentor of her youth, but someone worn by his own struggles. "Thank you for saying so, Mr. Henley. I hope you found peace." A sad smile crossed Thomas's face. "Not yet, but I'm trying." He tipped his hat to them both. "You have a beautiful family and a fine reputation in these parts. I'm glad life treated you better than I did." As he walked away, Grant looked down at Jane with a question in his eyes. "Are you all right?" Jane nodded, surprising herself with the genuine forgiveness she felt. "Yes, the past doesn't have the power it once did." Grant smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple where her scar began. "No, it doesn't." That autumn, Silver Springs held its harvest dance as it had for decades. The schoolhouse was again transformed with corn husks and paper lanterns, though now a proper dance floor had been installed thanks to donations from the Callahan Ranch. Jane watched as their daughter, now 8, twirled on the edge of the floor, practicing steps Grant had taught her. Their son sat with the other young boys, pretending disinterest while secretly watching the dancing with curious eyes. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Callahan?" Grant appeared beside her, hand extended just as it had been that night 10 years ago. Jane placed her hand in his, feeling the familiar calluses against her skin. "Always, Mr. Callahan." As they moved across the floor, Jane caught glimpses of their life together in the faces around them, former students now grown, neighbors who had become friends, their children watching with delight as their parents danced. "Remember what I told you that first night?" Grant murmured in her ear as they swayed to the music. "Dance only with me?" Jane smiled up at the man who had seen past her scars to the woman beneath. "Best advice I ever took." "I love you, Jane Callahan," he whispered, pulling her closer than was strictly proper for a public dance. "Every day more than the last." "And I love you, Grant Callahan." She rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady heartbeat that had become the rhythm of her life. "Always and only you." As the music played on and the harvest moon rose over Silver Springs, Jane reflected on the journey that had brought them here from mockery and loneliness to love and family, from scars both visible and hidden to healing neither had thought possible. The dance that had once been a source of dread had become a celebration of all they had built together. And as Grant spun her beneath the golden light of the lanterns, Jane knew with absolute certainty that no harvest had ever yielded a bounty as rich as the life they shared.